It's strange how belonging makes people uncomfortable. Say you belong to money, power, success, ambition, and no one flinches. Say you belong to something eternal, and suddenly the room goes quiet. Faces tighten. Smiles get polite. Because belonging means surrender, and surrender terrifies a world obsessed with control. I didn't arrive here chasing perfection or pretending to be clean. I arrived bruised, fractured, aware of how easily I break and how often I fail. Belonging wasn't a reward for being good, it was a rescue from becoming empty. Belonging is misunderstood because surrender has been dressed up as defeat for so long that people don't recognize it. When it shows up as strength, they hear the word and imagine chains, loss, submission without dignity. They picture someone kneeling because they were forced there, not because they chose to stop running. But surrender isn't collapse, it's clarity. It's the moment you realize you've been fighting battles you were never meant to win alone, carrying weights you keep pretending make you strong while they're quietly tearing you apart. The world worships control. Control over image, over future, over narrative, over pain. Lose control and you're labeled weak, unreliable, broken. So people cling to the illusion that they're self-made, self-sustained, self-rescuing. They wear exhaustion like a badge and call it independence. But surrender doesn't mean you're incapable. It means you're honest. Honest about limits. Honest about fractures. Honest about the quiet fear that no matter how tightly you grip your life, it keeps slipping through your fingers. Belonging requires surrender. Because you can't belong while still trying to sit on the throne. You can't claim an anchor while insisting on steering every storm. Surrender is the moment you stop negotiating terms and accept that your way hasn't delivered the peace it promised, and that terrifies people because surrender strips away excuses. You can't blame chaos when you've chosen alignment. You can't hide behind ego when you've handed over authority. You don't get to pretend you're fine when you've admitted you're not. Weakness is pretending you don't need help while quietly drowning. Strength is admitting you do and reaching for something solid instead of flailing harder. Surrender doesn't erase responsibility, it sharpens it. When you belong, your actions matter more, not less. Your choices reflect who you represent. Your failures aren't brushed off, but they're no longer fatal. There's accountability without annihilation, correction without rejection, discipline without abandonment. People confuse surrender with passivity, but surrender is active. It's a decision, not an accident. It's waking up and choosing alignment over impulse, obedience over ego, truth over comfort. It's resisting the urge to crown yourself king every time something goes wrong. It's saying no to the seductive lie that you are enough all by yourself, that you can heal yourself, justify yourself, save yourself if you just try harder. Belonging dismantles the performance. You stop auditioning. You stop building identity out of approval and applause. You stop needing to be impressive to feel secure. That kind of surrender threatens a world addicted to validation. Because when your worth is settled, manipulation loses its grip. Fear loses leverage. Failure loses its power to define you. You're no longer scrambling to prove you matter. You're living from the knowledge that you already do, and that's why surrender is framed as weakness. Because it creates people who can't be controlled the usual way. You can't threaten someone who knows where they belong. You can't bribe someone whose value isn't for sale. You can't destabilize someone anchored to something unshakable. They still feel pain, they still fall, they still wrestle with doubt and desire. But they're not owned by those things. Surrender also exposes the truth about pride. Pride doesn't always look loud or arrogant. Sometimes it looks responsible, disciplined, admirable. Sometimes it hides behind phrases like self-made, independent, resilient. But at its core, pride insists on being the final authority. It refuses to kneel, even when kneeling would heal. Surrender breaks that cycle, not by humiliating you, but by freeing you from the exhausting role of pretending you're invincible. Belonging doesn't erase your personality, it refines it. It doesn't silence your voice, it steadies it. You don't disappear when you surrender, you become coherent. Your contradictions stop fighting each other. Your impulses stop running the show. Your identity stops shifting with the room you're in. And that kind of stability isn't weakness, it's terrifyingly solid. Surrender is not giving up life. It's giving up the lie that you were meant to be your own God. It's stepping out of the chaos of self-rule and into something ordered, intentional, alive. And once you've tasted that kind of belonging, the idea that surrender is weakness starts to sound like a joke told by people who are still pretending. They're not exhausted from holding everything together by themselves. Identity rooted in faith doesn't bend every time the weather changes. It doesn't renegotiate its worth when applause fades or when failure walks in uninvited. Most people build themselves out of circumstances because circumstances are loud. Success tells you who you are when it's winning. Loss tells you who you are when it's losing. Approval flatters you into confidence. Rejection shoves you into doubt. And if that's where your identity lies, you'll spend your life shifting just to survive the room you're in. Circumstances are bullies. They demand explanations, reactions, adjustments. They whisper that you're only as valuable as your last achievement, only as strong as your last victory, only as relevant as your current position. One good season and you feel invincible. One bad season and you question everything. That kind of identity is fragile, constantly negotiating its worth with forces that don't care whether you break in the process. Faith-rooted identity doesn't argue with every storm. It doesn't panic when things fall apart. It doesn't inflate when things go well. It's not impressed by success and not destroyed by failure. That kind of identity was settled before the outcome showed up. It doesn't need circumstances to confirm it because it wasn't built by them. When life applauds, it doesn't get drunk on it. When life mocks, it doesn't collapse under it. People mistake confidence for noise. They think stability has to be loud, offensive, aggressive. But real stability is quiet. It doesn't need to convince anyone. It doesn't scramble for validation. It doesn't rewrite itself to stay acceptable. When identity is rooted in faith, you stop bargaining with the moment. You stop asking situations who you're allowed to be today. You move from response to conviction. Circumstances love to test loyalty. They ask questions like, are you still grounded when things go wrong? Are you still steady when nothing makes sense? Are you still anchored when prayers feel unanswered and doors stay shut? And that's where negotiation usually begins. People start trimming convictions to fit discomfort. They soften beliefs to avoid tension. They dilute truth to keep peace, because it's easier to bend than to stand when pressure rises. But identity rooted in faith doesn't seek comfort as its primary goal. It seeks alignment. And alignment costs something. It means you might stand alone. It means you might be misunderstood. It means you might look foolish to people who measure life by outcomes and status, but it also means you're not constantly reinventing yourself to survive every season. You're not adjusting your soul to fit the room. You're not letting chaos decide who you are. When circumstances define identity, fear becomes a manager. Fear of loss, fear of judgment, fear of being left behind, and fear is efficient. It keeps you compliant. It keeps you flexible in all the wrong ways. Faith-rooted identity fires fear from that role. Fear still shows up, but it doesn't get to make decisions. It doesn't get to redraw boundaries. It doesn't get to rename you. There's a certain calm that comes from knowing who you are before the crisis hits. You don't waste energy asking what this situation says about you. You don't spiral trying to decode meaning from every setback. You endure without dissolving. You adapt without surrendering your core. You walk through loss without letting loss define you. That doesn't make you numb. It makes you resilient in a way circumstances can't steal. People will try to label you based on where they meet you in your journey. When you're up, they'll celebrate you. When you're down, they'll diagnose you. Circumstances make people feel entitled to rename you. Faith-rooted identity refuses the rename. It doesn't argue. It doesn't perform. It simply continues. This kind of identity isn't built overnight. It's formed in tension, reinforced in silence, tested in seasons where nothing makes sense and everything feels delayed. It's strengthened every time you choose conviction over convenience, obedience over impulse, truth over applause. And slowly, you stop reacting to life like it's the authority and start moving through it like you already know who you are. When identity is rooted in faith, circumstances lose their power to redefine you. They can wound you, they can pressure you, they can confuse you, but they can't own you. You don't rise and fall with every external shift. You don't disappear when the lights go out. You don't inflate when things go right. You remain recognizable to yourself even when the world feels unfamiliar, even when the path gets dark, even when nothing around you confirms what you believe, because your identity was never up for negotiation in the first place. Grace is the most offensive idea to a performance-driven world. It disrupts the scoreboard. It laughs at the resume. It refuses to measure worth by output, consistency, or how well you hide your mess. People are comfortable with systems where value is earned, tracked, rewarded, and revoked. Work harder, be better, fail less, prove more. Grace walks into that system and knocks the table over. It says your value was never dependent on how impressive you are or how badly you've messed up, and that truth makes people nervous because it removes leverage. Performance feels safe because it's transactional. Do good, get rewarded. Do bad, get punished. Stay useful, stay accepted. Slip up, get replaced. It's clean, predictable, and brutal. Grace is none of those things. Grace doesn't negotiate. It doesn't ask how hard you tried or how sincere you sound. It doesn't flinch when you fall apart. And because it can't be controlled, it can't be exploited the way performance can. People who live on performance are exhausted even when they look successful. Every win raises the standard. Every failure threatens identity. There's no rest, only maintenance. Smile wider. Work longer. Hide better. Pretend you're fine. Grace interrupts that cycle. It says you are not your highlight reel, and you are not your worst moment either. And that kind of unconditional valuation feels dangerous to people who've built their entire sense of self on earning their place. Failure exposes the cracks in performance-based worth. One mistake, and everything shakes. One bad season, and the labels change. Reliable becomes disappointing. Strong becomes unstable. Admired becomes questioned. Grace doesn't erase consequences, but it refuses to erase you. It separates what you did from who you are, and that separation is revolutionary. It means you can be corrected without being condemned, broken without being discarded, and that's hard to accept because shame likes control. Shame tells you that you must fix yourself before you're allowed to belong. It whispers that you're tolerated at best, replaceable at worst. Grace silences that voice, not by arguing with it, but by ignoring it completely. Grace doesn't wait for you to become acceptable. It meets you where you are and insists you're already seen, already known, already claimed. Success doesn't impress Grace either. That's another insult to the ego. Achievements don't increase your value. Discipline doesn't earn you extra love. Doing everything right doesn't move you up the ladder because there was no ladder to begin with. Grace treats the strong and the weak the same way, and that feels unfair to people who've worked hard to distinguish themselves. It levels the room. It removes hierarchy. It tells everyone to sit down. Living under grace doesn't make you careless. It makes you honest. When your value isn't on the line, you stop lying to protect it. You stop pretending you're better than you are. You stop defending yourself every time you're exposed. You can admit fault without panic. You can face your darkness without collapsing. You don't need to polish your failures into inspirational stories just to justify your existence. Performance motivates through fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of being found out. Grace motivates differently. It pulls instead of pushes. It doesn't say do better or else. It says you're safe, now grow. That kind of motivation runs deeper. It changes behavior from the inside instead of managing it from the outside. It doesn't force obedience. It invites transformation. People misunderstand grace as permission to stay the same. It's not. Grace doesn't excuse the damage you cause or the choices you make. It simply refuses to make your value dependent on perfection. It creates space for real change because change no longer threatens your belonging. You don't evolve to earn love. You evolve because you're loved, and that's why grace is so unsettling. It removes all the familiar tools people use to control themselves and others. No more guilt as a leash. No more shame as a motivator. No more superiority built on moral comparison. Grace leaves you exposed with nothing to hide behind except truth. When performance defines value, you're always acting. When grace defines value, you can finally stop. You don't have to prove you deserve to exist. You don't have to outrun your past. You don't have to keep score to feel secure. You can stand still in the middle of your imperfections without fear of being erased. Grace doesn't make life easier. It makes it clearer. It strips away the illusion that you can save yourself through effort alone. It confronts the ego without crushing it. It humbles without humiliating. And once you realize your value isn't tied to how well you perform or how badly you fail, the whole game changes. The masks start to slip. The pressure loses its grip, and you begin to move through the world without constantly auditioning for permission to belong. Choosing who you belong to isn't a soft decision, it's a violent one. It cuts through habits, impulses, excuses, and identities you've been dragging around because they felt familiar. People like to think decisions are isolated, that you choose this or that in the moment and move on. But belonging sits underneath all of it, quietly steering the wheel while you argue about direction. Who you belong to decides what you tolerate, what you resist, what you justify, what you walk away from. When no one is forcing your hand, most people don't choose who they belong to, they drift. They belong to comfort, to fear, to approval, to whatever keeps the noise down. They belong to moods, to appetite, to the room they're in. And because of that, their decisions look random, inconsistent, contradictory. One day they're brave, the next day they're silent. One day they're principled, the next day they're flexible. Not because they're evil, but because nothing is anchored. Belonging clarifies. Once you know who you belong to, decisions stop being debates and start being filters. Not easy filters, but clear ones. You don't ask what feels good right now, you ask what aligns. You don't ask what gets applause, you ask what's faithful. You don't ask what helps you win the moment, you ask what keeps you intact long term. And that kind of clarity is threatening to a world that thrives on confusion and impulse. Every decision exposes allegiance. How you speak when you're angry, what you do when you're tempted, who you protect when there's a cost, whether you stay silent or stand up when silence would be safer. Those aren't personality quirks, they're loyalty tests. They reveal who has authority over you when pressure shows up. And pressure always shows up. Belonging reshapes desire itself. You don't just act differently, you start wanting different things. The cravings that once controlled you lose their volume. The shortcuts that once tempted you lose their shine. Not because you suddenly became disciplined, but because your loyalty changed. When you belong to something higher, lower things don't satisfy the same way. They still call to you, but they don't command you. People say faith complicates life. The truth is, it simplifies it in the most uncomfortable way possible. It removes options. It closes doors you used to keep open just in case. It forces decisions earlier than you'd like. You can't hide in ambiguity forever when belonging has already been declared. You can't pretend you don't know what to do when you've already decided. Who you answer to. Choosing who you belong to also exposes cost. There are things you stop doing not because they're illegal or unpopular, but because they're misaligned. There are conversations you leave, environments you outgrow, opportunities you decline, not because they aren't attractive, but because they would require you to betray something settled. And betrayal always starts small, dressed up as practicality, convenience, or realism. Belonging also changes how you handle failure. When you don't belong to anything bigger than yourself, every mistake is a threat. It questions your worth. It destabilizes your identity. But when belonging is settled, failure becomes correction, not condemnation. You don't spiral trying to protect an image. You adjust, repent, realign, and keep moving. The decision-making process doesn't collapse just because you stumbled. People will misunderstand your decisions when they don't share your allegiance. They'll call you extreme, rigid, naive, outdated. They'll assume you're afraid or controlled because they can't imagine choosing limits willingly. But limits are only cages when you didn't choose what you belong to. When you did, limits become protection boundaries, direction. Every small decision trains you, what you watch, what you laugh at, what you excuse, what you ignore, what you confront. Those choices don't feel spiritual, but they're deeply revealing. They show who has influence over your instincts. Belonging isn't proven in declarations, it's proven in repetition, in what you do consistently when it would be easier not to. And here's the part no one advertises. Choosing who you belong to means you don't get to blame confusion anymore. You don't get to pretend you didn't know better. You don't get to outsource responsibility to circumstance or emotion. Belonging gives you clarity, and clarity removes excuses. That's why people avoid choosing it. Drifting feels safer than deciding, because drifting lets you claim innocence. But once belonging is chosen, every decision becomes an echo of that choice. Not perfect, not effortless, but intentional. You stop being surprised by your own behavior. You stop waking up wondering how you got here. You start recognizing yourself in your decisions, even the hard ones, even the costly ones, even the ones that make no sense to people who don't know who you belong to and never had to wrestle with the weight of choosing something that shapes everything instead of letting everything shape you.